Good day. In my previous video, my video of yesterday, I said that it was uncertain to me whether the Russian reinforcements that were being sent to Krasny Liman or Liman were intended to reinforce the garrison there or to pull the garrison out of Liman. It has in fact been pulled out of Liman and has been withdrawn to safer places. Now, I repeat my own personal view, which, by the way, I see is increasingly shared by a number of other people, which is that this is a sideshow, and that I suspect one of the reasons why the Russians were unwilling to devote too much time and energy to the defense of Liman was precisely because they don't consider it to be quite as important in the broader scheme of things than some other people do. But having said that, there was one interesting aspect to the Liman affair, a political aspect, which I think I'm going to touch on, because it brought out into the open tensions which appear to exist between Kadyrov, the leader of Chechnya, and his political ally, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is the leader of the Wagner Group, and the Russian military command. Now, in the hours after Liman was abandoned, Kadyrov published an extraordinary piece on his blog in which he severely took to task the Russian military leadership and blamed a particular Russian general, General Lapin, for the failure, the defeat at Liman. And the blog piece gave the impression that Lapin, who had previously received decorations and who had been the overall military commander at the time of the capture of the Lugansk city of Lysychansk, that Lapin had been responsible for the defense of this entire area, and that it was Lapin who supposedly had withdrawn, taken up his headquarters, his command post in Lugansk city, kept his headquarters, his general headquarters, far in the rear, had little contact with the troops, didn't seem to know very much about what was going on, and who was, according to Kadyrov, responsible for the entire debacle. A few hours later, there was another social media message, this time by Yevgeny Prigozhin, the man who's set up the Wagner Group, and Prigozhin has come back and has essentially said that he supports Kadyrov's assessment. Now, the Russian military themselves have maintained been tight-lipped about this outburst of recriminations, but various other people, bloggers and ex-military people of that kind, have come forward and have said that Kadyrov's criticisms of Lapin are actually misplaced. Lapin was not the commander of the Western Military District, which is the military district within Russia that was responsible for the operations in Kharkiv region and in Liman. That general was a general called Zhuravlyov, and Lapin's only role in the battle was to command the reinforcements from the 58th Army, which falls under his overall command, the reinforcements from the 58th Army, which rushed to Liman yesterday and rescued the garrison of 500 men who had been in danger of being surrounded there. Now, a short time after, we got all those comments from various people defending General Lapin and speaking of him as, in fact, an outstanding commander and somebody who is actually very visible in the front line of the troops and who actually took a similarly proactive approach to command when he was commanding forces in Syria. Shortly after we got all those defenses of Lapin being published, we learned that General Zhuravlyev, the commander of the Western Military District, had been dismissed, and that his replacement is Lieutenant General Roman Berdnikov, who was formerly commander of the 29th Combined Arms Army of the Eastern Military District, but who is known to be apparently a protege of General Surovikin, who I recall was another of the generals who played a role in the capture of Severodonetsk, Lysychansk. It's quite an interesting little affair, in my opinion, because it shows that there is a certain amount of bad blood between the irregular forces, that's to say Kadyrov and his Chechens, and Prigozhin and the Wagner Group, and the Russian regular military, who clearly don't always get on with these irregular forces as one might expect that they would do, given the nature of a war like this. Anyway, it has had the effect of causing General Zhuravlyov to lose his post, and we'll see whether the person who takes over from him does any better. I'm going to repeat again, I think that this is something of a sideshow. I remember when Liman was captured by the Russian or Allied forces back in May. And it was, by the way, captured very quickly. The Ukrainian garrison essentially fled and failed to put up a fight. And I don't remember any comment about it at all in the Western media at that time. Nobody was suggesting that this was a town of any particular strategic significance. Russian bloggers and commentators, however, were saying that its capture did open the way to an advance on Slavyansk from the east, except of course that this never happened because the much bigger advance from the north never took place. From the north, from Izium, never took place. So overall and in general, I'm not sure that Liman actually did have any particular military importance and significance. I'll come back to what I'm saying. The big event of the last week is not, in my opinion, the current battles which are still raging in this area of Donbass, or indeed a renewed attempt by the Ukrainian military to launch some kind of offensive in Kherson region, which doesn't seem to be going particularly well, again. It's the fact that these four regions have now been incorporated in the Russian Federation, and that the Russians are now committed to defending them as if they were Russian territory. And we are seeing more and more films and reports now of more and more Russian troops pouring into this area, obviously preparing for some big offensive at some point or some kind of military action. And of course, in the meantime, we're also getting reports about the mobilization in Russia having now essentially been completed. The reservists have been called up, they've been put through their training, and no doubt we will see over the next few weeks all these new troops and all this new equipment starting to have its effect. Meanwhile, there was one rather strange incident yesterday, which was an incident which was initiated by Ukraine itself. The Ukrainians made an attempt to get themselves pushed into NATO. Zelensky made a request for what was supposed to be an accelerated procedure into NATO. In other words, he wanted instant membership of NATO directly after the announcement of the referendums and the decision by Putin to sign accession treaties on Friday, and the military developments that took place over the next couple of days. And the interesting thing about that was that this request to join NATO received a very, very dismissive response, the response was not only dismissive, it was also very subdued. I'm going to say something, which is that the whole response of the West to the latest events seems to me very strangely subdued. There's been very little commentary or discussion in the Western media or by Western governments about the attacks on the Nord Stream pipelines, even though to my mind these two were amongst the big events of last week. In fact, they might be arguably the biggest single events of all. But there's been no outright claim so far that the Russians were responsible, though I expect that eventually will happen. There's been little said or spoken about this problem, either by Western governments or by the media. It's as if the whole Nord Stream affair has been, well, there's been some instruction to say as little about it as possible. And I have to say that, again, the referendums and Putin's signature of his accession treaty and the speech that he gave on Friday also, in total, attracted remarkably little attention in the West. And I wonder why that is, actually. Well, I suspect that in Europe, it's because, as I've said, we are in some kind of a death spiral economically at the moment. We are seeing our economies sinking rapidly. By the way, there was an opinion poll which I saw published setting out the present position of the political parties in Britain. It gives the Conservative Party just 21% of the vote and gives Labour 54% of the vote. Now, I don't expect that to happen in an election, and I don't expect an election to happen anytime soon. But I would say that for a government party to be polling these kind of figures, usually it means that in Britain at least, its days in government are numbered. The Conservative government might stagger on for another 2 years, but it seems to me that after the events of the last few weeks, the fall of Boris Johnson, the rise in household costs, the emergence of Liz Truss as Prime Minister, and the disastrous budget that her Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, mini-budget that her Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng announced on Friday, it seems to me that the British government is holed under the waterline and almost certainly knows it. And for that reason, it's perhaps becoming less interested in problems in Ukraine. And I'm getting the sense that the same might be true elsewhere in Europe as well. There seems to be a sudden realization about how bad things have become and how much worse they might soon be getting. There was talk, it seems that Russian gas to Italy has now stopped entirely. The Russians say it's because of problems transiting gas through through Austria, because of changes in regulatory procedures in Austria which haven't been resolved, and that might or might not be related to sanctions. The Italian government has acted extremely negatively to this decision and has called in the Russian ambassador for explanations. I don't see what good that is going to do. But as I said, sooner or later, I think sooner now, we're starting to get the sense that in Europe, at least, it's not that enthusiasm for Ukraine has dimmed amongst the European political class so much as that they sense that they're becoming overwhelmed by problems which I suspect they didn't fully anticipate. Let me repeat again, the biggest, most important fallacy of what has happened in over the course of this crisis. There's been much discussion about the war. The war is what tends to attract the headlines. It's the easy to talk about the movement backwards and forwards of troops and machines. It's exciting. It can sometimes feel like a film. But the biggest mistake that was made was right at the outset, not just by the United States, but principally by its European allies, when they decided in February to cast all restraints aside and wage an outright economic war against Russia. And the obvious expectation was that this economic war would trigger a collapse of the Russian economy. It would crater it, to use the expression, and that as a result of that Russian economy becoming cratered, there would be political protests in Russia, and the government of President Putin would fall. And the result was that things that had been apparently ruled out, like the de-swifting of Russian banks and the sanctions against Russian energy, suddenly became part of the agenda. And of course, things that had never been discussed because they had never ever been considered possible, like the sanctions against the Russian central bank and the seizure of its assets, its foreign currency assets held in Western countries, that happened as well. And remarkably, governments like those of Germany, which in the run-up to the conflict and whilst the sanctions were being discussed, had appeared to rule out all of these options, went along with all of them. So that the result is that the Europeans find themselves now in the midst of an economic war that they had never planned for and never prepared for, because they did things that they told each other and the Americans that they would never do. There seems to have been some kind of casual expectation that, as I said, all of the weight of all of these measures would somehow sink the Russian economy, and that they wouldn't therefore have to be in place for very long. What's now happened is that the Russian economy has proved enormously resilient. It has been able essentially to brush off and withstand these sanctions. And the result is that Western leaders, especially in Europe, now find themselves in a situation which they never planned for. And moreover, with the crisis in Europe escalating, they're now finding that their lines of retreat are being cut off for them. So we've had the explosions in the Nord Stream pipeline system, which the Russians say is repairable, probably, but it might take a very long time to repair, and one can't come to a clear conclusion as to how long that would be before the damage itself is assessed, which is fair enough. But anyway, the long and the short of all this is that the Europeans are now in a position where they can't reverse course, even though they're now committed to a course which a year ago they insisted they never would be, and for which they are not prepared. And I come back to what I was saying in my program yesterday. I don't know that they know exactly what to do in this situation. The affair in Britain, as I said previously, looks to me like a canary in the coal mine, because one European government, and let's remember, though Britain is not a member of the EU, it is nonetheless geographically a part of the European continent, and it's still deeply connected in all kinds of ways with European structures and the West European economies. One government, the British government, did try to come up with some sort of a response. It sought to freeze household energy bills and kickstart the economy by cutting taxes. Except, of course, that this blew up in its face because of the underlying economic problems. And I can't help but think that the same is going to happen to any other plans that any other European government or European governments collectively now come up with. What exactly in this kind of situation do? They already were struggling with a major inflation increase last year before this conflict even began. They've made that inflation crisis far worse by adding to their supply side difficulties through their sanctions on Russian energy and their unspoken but very real sanctions against Russian fertilizer and Russian food. There's now apparently fears that the Russians might start easing back on supplying nuclear fuel, and they are the dominant supplier of nuclear fuel. And if they start cutting back on supplies of nuclear fuel, that will have a massive impact on nuclear power industries in Europe and in North America, and of course in many other places as well. It will add to the general sense of crisis. So they are, I think, unsure what to do. And I suspect that what's going to happen over the next couple of weeks and months is what we're going to see European governments and Western governments probably in general start to give less attention to Ukraine as they become increasingly absorbed with their own problems. No government wants to lose an election. The British government is heading definitely in that direction. The German government's position, I suspect, is pretty precarious because I doubt that the coalition there is especially stable. And beyond that, other governments like those in France and the new government in Italy are going to be very worried that unless they can turn things round in some ways, they're heading for electoral oblivion also. So I suspect that over the next few weeks and months, this is what's going to concern principally European politicians and European media also. So we may be hearing a little less about Ukraine over the next few weeks and months, especially if, after the autumn rains, things do begin to slow down on the battlefields. In my opinion, that would be no bad thing. It might mean that finally, eventually, political space for some kind of negotiated solution might start to emerge. Or if not that, well, who knows? Things might start to happen in Ukraine and in Russia, which might change things, allowing for the possibility that Western interference and Western meddling might lose something of its intensity. Well, we will see one way or the other, but I can fully understand why, given the many problems Western governments are facing at the moment, Zelensky's application for immediate NATO membership received such a cool response. Well, it's been a shorter video today. As I said, if you discount the news from the Liman front, about which altogether too much has been written, I think there's altogether less news to talk about. I expect things to change dramatically next week, when on Tuesday or Wednesday, the 4 regions do become formally a part of the Russian Federation, and we probably are going to get something very close to a Russian ultimatum to Ukraine, and we'll see what happens next. But for the moment, as I said, a reasonably quiet day, a day to reflect, as happens often on Sundays, and I will obviously keep you informed as things move on and begin to change. Thank you for joining me again today. Remember, you can join us on other platforms, Locals, Rumble, ODYSEE, BitChute and Telegram. And please remember that on Locals, I do my Wednesday live streams exclusively on Locals every Wednesday at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time, 1900 hours London time. You can join me then and ask me whatever questions you wish on that Locals live stream. I will either answer them in the live stream itself or in a follow-up video or videos. And you can also join us, and I mentioned the other platforms. You can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can find the links under this video, and you can also support us by going to our shop and buying the great things you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all the rest. Last but not least, if you want to support our work, please remember to tick the like button if you've liked this video, and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. A shorter video than usual, reflecting the dearth of news, but I'm sure that will change fairly soon. And until then, have a very good day.